Good evening, Professor Naar, dear students, dear colleagues, dear members of this Zoom webinar, dear members at the live stream via YouTube. A warm welcome to all of you for the last session this year of our virtual lecture series, Ambivalente Nachbarschaften, Ambivalent Neighborhoods. Thank you so much for joining us today and joining a special session. Last week, as you can remember, Professor Amina America took us to Sarajevo during the 17th and 18th century and analyzed the ambivalent concept and equally complex reality of what was called in Bosnian language komšiluk, of neighborhood, in a context in which the Muslim population was the majority, while Jews tried at the same time to preserve their religious, cultural, and social distinctiveness as other minorities did, and to participate at the same time in the life of surrounding society. And today we are moving, first of all, to the 20th century and to another multi-ethnic and multi-religious context with a strong Jewish population, to Salonika during the period of transition from Ottoman to Greek sovereignty. I think a most interesting case study on neighboring religious and political cultures, which may shed light on Jewish identities, this time in a Christian Orthodox context, between Judaism, Ottoman, and local Salonican traditions, and the emerging Greek national state. And I'm delighted that I succeeded in convincing Professor Devin E to present us his interpretations of these questions involved. He's one of the foremost experts on Jewish Salonika and the Spheric experience in the Mediterranean world in the modern period, and a wonderful dialogue partner for us tonight. Let me please briefly introduce him before we listen to his presentation. By the way, tonight is only here in Frankfurt. He's talking from Seattle, which means it's 9:15, so he's very early in the morning. Devin E is the Isaac Al-Hadef Professor in Sephardic Studies, and he's also an Associate Professor of History and a faculty member of the Stroom Center for Jewish Studies in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. He studied at Washington University in St. Louis and received his PhD in history at Stanford University, I think in 2011, and then joined the university in Seattle after a year that he spent as a Fulbright Fellow in Greece. His field of research includes studies on empire and colonialism, Greek Jewish studies, Sephardic studies in general, studies on migrations, especially from Europe to the Americas, relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the former Ottoman Empire, and many more, especially also questions regarding race and ethnicity. And these are all topics that are, of course, of great importance for our lecture series. I would like to actually show you this wonderful book that I have read a year ago, his book, Jewish Salonika, Between the Ottoman Empire and Modern Greece. It was published by Stanford University Press in 2016, and it won a National Jewish Book Award in the category of research based on archival material. And Devin will actually talk about the relevance of archives for his project and his research in a minute. Jewish Salonika is really a fascinating book, which I can only recommend. It explores the impact of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of modern Greece during the 19th and 20th centuries on the Jewish community of Salonika. And you may know that Salonika is a Mediterranean port city that was once home to the largest Judeo Spanish-speaking Jewish community in the world. And the book traces the many ways in which Jews in Salonika came to grappled with the end of the Ottoman Empire and their new national Greek context. And I think the great contribution of this original and very well written book is that it draws on a wide range of primary sources which have been unknown or at least unresearched in the past, archives, newspapers in Judeo-Spanish and in other languages, Greek, Hebrew, and French. He then started another book project, which has the working title Reimagining the Sephardic Diaspora, which is a book that explores the dispersal of Sephardic Jews from the dissolving Ottoman Empire during the early 20th century and the creation of new Sephardic centers in Europe and the Americas. And that includes, as far as I understand, also Seattle, where he teaches. This project focuses on transnational migration by exploring the links Sephardic Jews retained with their native communities and the relationships they developed with other Jews and migrants from the Mediterranean. I've seen with great interest that as the chair of the new Sephardic Studies program of the Strum Center for Jewish Studies in Seattle, Devin E has also launched a project that collects and preserves Sephardic and Ladino historical, literary, cultural heritage sources. So he plays a leading role in creating the first major online Sephardic studies digital library and archive, which comprises many artifacts, books, and letters which are of interest for this area of research. Devin, I think we met almost a decade ago, or even more, at Oxford University during a summer school for PhD students in Jewish history and culture. And I'm so delighted to see you again, even if it's only in a webinar, and to be able to listen to your research tonight. I know it's rather early in Seattle, but still you will be fit to talk to us, and we will still hopefully be awake enough to listen to you. The talk is entitled Jewish and Orthodox Christians and the Contest over Greek National Identity in the 20th Century. We're very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Christian. That was a lovely introduction, and it's a great honor and privilege for me to have the chance to address your academic community there. I only wish we could be in person, but perhaps one day we'll have that chance. Our time together at Oxford, that was many years ago already, but it was very formative for me, and I'm grateful for all of the feedback that you provided me then and all of our colleagues there. And so now you'll get a sense, obviously you've looked at my book, but for everyone else, get a sense of how my research has developed. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Okay. And so the question that I wanted to address today as it relates to this series about ambivalent neighbors has to do with the framework of national identity in the wake of imperial dissolution and the formulations of national identity, the contested formulations of national identity in the context of Greece, as it relates to the possibility of Jews entering into the Greek nation, and what are the limits and the contours of that geopolitical conceptual framework. Now, this is an auspicious year to be discussing Greek national identity because, as some of you may know, this year, 2021, is the bicentennial of the start of the Greek War of Independence, of the Greek Revolutionary War in 1821. What's important from our perspective is that the revolutionary call for Greek independence was articulated in 1821 in the name of faith and fatherland. So those two elements were inextricably linked from the beginning, faith being Orthodox Christian faith and fatherland being this new entity to emerge called Greece. And this was institutionalized in the first constitution of independent Greece in 1822, which declared that those indigenous inhabitants of the state of Greece who believe in Christ are Greeks. Okay, so from the very beginning, Greek national identity formation was very closely connected to religious identity, in this case, Christianity and Orthodox Christianity in particular. It's also worth noting that by the time of the conclusion of the Greek War of Independence, and scholars debate when exactly we should end this war, 1830, 1832, some continue it longer. In independent Greece, there were essentially no non-Christians remaining in independent Greece. Essentially, all of the Muslims and Jews, with few exceptions, had been either killed or expelled. And this is actually, in some ways, the birth of the modern nation state as it's formulated outside of Western Europe, and as it's formulated in the context of pluralistic societies that are transformed into homogeneous societies over the course of the 19th and into the 20th centuries. Greece is, in some ways, as scholars, Mark Mazauer has just written a book about the Greek Revolutionary War, and he also emphasizes this point that scholars have been making for some time, that Greece could be understood as the first nation state in Europe, articulated along these lines, and it is kind of a nation state avant la lettre, because the term nation state is coined really during World War I, but the concept, one people, one language, one religion, contained inside of one set of geopolitical boundaries, that is already manifest in the case of Greece, beginning with the War of Independence in 1821. So what will become the place of Jews in this state that is articulated specifically with Christianity as a defining feature? It is established with violence against Jews and Muslims, and it is articulated not only as a war of liberation against the Ottoman overlords, but also as one of national consolidation. There would be a very small Jewish population in Greece over the course of the 19th century, even as its boundaries expanded. And into the 20th century, the bulk of the Jews that would come to call Greece its home, their home, would be incorporated during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, as Christian mentioned, with the incorporation of Salonika or Thessaloniki into Greece. And in order to develop and understand how Jews and Orthodox Christians debated, contested, negotiated the contours of Greek national identity, I'd like to look at a series of archives and other kinds of sources that largely had not been explored extensively prior to my research, with the exception of one or two scholars in Israel who took a peek at some of the materials. There is a contemporary element here that makes this topic kind of pressing, which is, some of you may have noticed that last week there was a news item that continues to be discussed. It wasn't very widely publicized, but in Greek and some Jewish or Israeli sites in English and certainly in other languages, there was notice of Russia giving back either sometimes described Jewish Holocaust archives or the pre-war Jewish archives to Greece. And this is really a fascinating thing for me because it's not every day. This was actually at a summit between Putin and Mitsotakis, the PM of Greece, in which Putin declared that Russia would return the Jewish archives of Greece that had been, as this second headline says, transferred to Moscow after the Red Army took Berlin in 1945. Not every day that Putin is talking about the material that I used to write my book, or international leaders are using the archives that form the basis of my book as a diplomatic negotiation chip. This is part of a summit that is taking place that's seeking to enhance relations between Greece and Russia through tourism and commerce, and also security. Ukraine is an area of consideration and concern. And it's of note that as part of this summit, Mitsotakis, the Greek PM, actually referenced the role that the Russian Empire played in supporting the Greek revolutionaries back in the 19th century. And this should be a sign that there are long-standing warm relations between Greece and Russia. And that, by the way, that support early on in the 19th century, that was based on shared Orthodox Christian faith, that Russia saw itself somehow in part responsible for the Orthodox Christians living inside of the Ottoman Empire. So what happened to the archives such that they should wind up in Moscow? I can't answer all of those questions right now, but I would like to try to give you a sense of what these archives may offer us as scholars, because even though they may be going home to Greece soon, there's reason to be skeptical, because already in the 1990s, once the Soviet Union fell, there was discussion of the Jewish archives from Greece, along with many other Jewish archives and artifacts that have been confiscated by the Nazis and subsequently reconfiscated by the Soviet military. A lot of discussion about those materials going back. Some of it has been returned, but in the case of Greece, nothing has been returned, even though the existence of the materials have been known since the 90s. How did the materials get confiscated in the first place? One of the first acts that the Nazi occupation forces undertook with their occupation of Greece in the spring of 1941 was through the Einsatzreichsleiter Rosenberg, was the confiscation of the Jewish community archives, which was undertaken really as a way to debilitate and destabilize the Jewish institutions in the city. And we will see why that was such a major enterprise and how it really undercut the ability of the Jewish community to do its work. This was not unique to Greece, but this was one of the initiatives that the German occupation forces undertook in many, if not most of the countries that they occupied, which was to confiscate materials, archival materials in libraries that contained material that was believed to be against the Reich. So that was really anything that was Jewish, anything that designated or seemed to hint at connections between Jewish communities, so like international Jewish conspiracy, and anything related to Freemasons. All this stuff was confiscated in libraries, intellectual material. A lot of it was sent to Frankfurt, where there was the idea to create the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question. And the idea there was basically, wouldn't it be an accomplishment of civilization to gather together all the cultural inheritance of a people, the Jewish people, that the Nazi forces would have wiped off the face of the map. So there is an ironic moment and process through which the destruction of a people became intimately connected to the preservation of their cultural heritage, almost kind of as war spoils or a monument to that act of destruction. Through almost a miraculous series of events, while the vast majority of the Jews of Greece, and especially in the case of Salonika, were exterminated by the Nazis, pieces, fragments of the archive of the Jewish community of Salonika were preserved and survive today. The thousands of peoples whose names and lives are recorded in those archives, they were exterminated. But record of them, documents about them, sometimes their photograph, maybe their signature, maybe small other details about their lives, everyday lives of everyday people, the leaders, are available for us to access and analyze. Already in the wake of the war, one of the leader of the Jewish community of Salonika began to document the archives and the libraries that had been confiscated by the Nazi occupation forces. And here's one such document, written in Judeo-Spanish and Ladino in Latin script. And so there's a great concern in the wake of the war about what happened to these archives, because it was understood these are the records of the community. And there was also great interest because within those records contained quite a bit of documentation about properties. And in the wake of the war, the very small remnant, we're talking about on the eve of the war, 50,000 Jews, 55,000 Jews. In the wake of the war, there are only 1,200. So very, very high mortality rate. The community as an institution and the survivors are interested in getting back some of their properties, because when they return to a city that has been decimated. The nearly 60 synagogues are either mostly destroyed, some by the German occupation forces, some by Orthodox Christian collaborators. And the few survivors, all of whose properties have been confiscated, again, through the collaboration of the Greek state and the German occupation forces, have no homes. And so they are forced to sleep on the benches of the last remaining synagogue that was not destroyed during the war. So they want their homes. They want to re-establish their lives. So they want the archives to help them with their documentation claims. The Greek Foreign Ministry receives a telegram in 1946 saying, here you can see the letter in Greek and the telegram in English, that the archives of the synagogue of Salonika, which is a term they used to mean the Jewish community of Salonika, have been located. And they've been located in a part of the former Reich. And in fact, there are the archives of the Jewish community of Salonika, like the archives and libraries of other Jewish communities, wind up in all different places in the former Nazi regime. Some wind up in the American zone of occupation, and they will become, some will be sent to New York, some will be sent back to Greece, and then from there clandestinely smuggled out of Greece during the era of the junta in the early 1970s and brought to Israel, where they are located at the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People. Some materials will wind up in the Soviet zone of occupation, and those materials won't become known, as I mentioned, until after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. But the thing that nobody really knows is that all of these materials have already been microfilmed, partly cataloged, and are available at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Part of these materials I personally cataloged and archived myself when I was a Fulbright scholar in Greece. We located a whole nother cache of archives that likely had been confiscated by the Nazis, returned through the mechanisms that I just described via the American, the Offenbach archival facility to the Jewish community in Greece. And so these materials, but because of other pressing priorities and reasons that remain a little bit unclear, we don't know exactly why these archives were not accounted for, and nobody knew about them until I went there and I cataloged them. We put together a nice exhibition at the Jewish Museum. You can go now to the Jewish Museum of Thessaloniki and you can look at these materials in person. And these materials, like the material that is at the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People in Jerusalem, like the material that is in Moscow, like some of the material that wound up in New York at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, the material is extensive. It is fascinating, and it is largely unstudied. So what I'd like to ask today is, what do these archives tell us about the history of the Jews of Salonika, and as it relates to the topic today, about Jewish Orthodox Christian relations in Greece in relationship to the formulation of Greek national identity? I'd like to suggest that if we examine these records and these archives, we get a very different picture of life in the city. And we can challenge what I would suggest are two of the main kinds of narratives about the Jewish experience in Salonika. As Christian mentioned, Salonika was home to the largest of the Ladino-speaking Jewish communities in the world. At the turn of the 20th century, as the previous map just indicated, approximately half of the population of the entire city, which was a major Ottoman port city on the Aegean Sea, were Jews. So much so was their influence that the entire city essentially closed from Friday night to Saturday night in observance of the Jewish Sabbath. The prosperity and predominance of Jews in the city was such that the city even garnered the nickname the Jerusalem of the Balkans, like other great Jewish metropolises, Lithuania, Vilna in Lithuania being kind of the Jerusalem of Lita, a kind of a diasporic Jewish center. And so that's sort of like one narrative of the city, of kind of this amazing center of Jewish vibrancy and life, cultural productivity. It was a city that David Ben-Gurion visited in 1911, and he called it a Hebrew labor town, the only one in the world, because of the way in which Jews participated in every social and economic strata in the city. There were not only rabbis and teachers and lawyers and merchants and businessmen, but also stevedores and peddlers and pumpkin seed sellers and prostitutes and gangsters. It was kind of like a complete Jewish society, as it was kind of romanticized by figures like Ben-Gurion, or from another political perspective, Jabotinsky made similar observations about the power of the Salonican Jewish community and the Salonican Jewish workers. That image is set in contradistinction to another image of the Jews of Salonika as a Jewish community that is enfeebled, that is in decline, that is under attack, that the Jews have become, in the context of the Greek state after the city's incorporation into Greece following the Balkan Wars, they have become unwanted enemies. They have become foreign interlopers. They have become a challenge to Greek hegemony. And many Jews leave. So if we're talking about 80 or 90,000 Jews at the turn of the 20th century, by the German occupation of the city in 1941, we only have about 55,000 Jews, and the vast majority of that decline in demographics can be attributed to migration, and we'll look at that a little bit later. But that's not the only story, and when you look at the archives, we get a very different image of what is going on. This image here just gives you a sense of this defining moment from the world of the Ottoman Empire to the world of the Greek state. And this would be a great rupture for everybody in the region, but in particular for the Jews, who would, their self-vision would be transformed from recognizing or imagining themselves, despite their internal differences, despite very intense tensions between the upper classes and the vast working classes. There was a sense that Salonika was their city, or at least they belonged to the city. And now, in the context of a Greek state, with new administration coming from Athens, with many of the local authorities displaced by a new bureaucracy, the name eventually would be changed from Salonik, or Saloniko as it was called in Ladino, or Salonique in French, Thessaloniki in Greek, which would be formalized not until 1937. But all of these kinds of cultural codes that switch would be signs of new sovereigns and the uncertain status of Jews in Greece. It should be recognized that for this reason, some Jews, especially Jewish merchants, were not so keen on the prospect of having their city incorporated into Greece. So some proposed as an alternative to the incorporation of the city into Greece, or Bulgaria, which was another option at the time, was Jewish autonomy in Salonika. It was considered in the same breath here in the New York Times as Jewish autonomy in Palestine. And what the New York Times goes on to say, and this was much discussed at the time, was, well, look, there are more Jews in Salonika than in Palestine. There are more established Jewish institutions in Salonika than in Palestine. If we're going to create a Jewish state, maybe it ought to be in Salonika rather than Palestine, or maybe both. As we know, of course, there was no Jewish state in Salonika that was ever created, but that idea, that sense of connection between Jews and the city, and how they would try to negotiate this transition into a place in which they would be very far away from having autonomy in this city, would be a major preoccupation for the Jewish leadership and everyday Jews. A problem that would be compounded not only by the violence and disruption of the Balkan Wars, but also World War I, which would come on its heels. And during that war, in which the British and French militaries essentially occupied the city, it burnt down in a massive fire in 1917. It left over 70,000 residents of the city homeless, including more than 50,000 Jews. Over 30 synagogues were destroyed. The schools, Jewish schools, were destroyed. The center of the city that just happened to correspond with the main centers of Jewish residents in the city were also reduced to ash. And among that which was reduced to ash were the vast archives of the Jewish community of Salonika. The fire was transformative insofar as the Greek state used the opportunity to transform what had been Ottoman and Jewish Salonika into Greek Thessaloniki, and redesigned and rebuilt the city according to a modern Hellenic plan that displaced Jews and Muslims from the center of the city. One of the responses, as I alluded to before, was migration. So here you can see the Salonika restaurant and cafe, which is kosher, as is indicated here, on the Lower East Side of New York. And many Saloniklis, as they called themselves, would wind up in New York, others in France, others in Palestine and elsewhere. My father's family coming to the United States in this period, in the early 1920s, from Salonika. But the fire also, as I mentioned, decimated the archives. And so one of the first tasks that the Jewish community undertook in the wake of the fire was to reconstitute the archives, to find out who their community was, where their members resided, and to see if they could take care of them. So they initiated a massive recensement, as they called it, a French word that they introduced into Judeo-Spanish. And they composed 24 volumes that look like this, that listed 75,000 Jews in the city. Of those 24 volumes, I've been able to identify only 7, several of which are in this archive in Moscow, several of which are in New York. And here you can see one of these volumes, just to give you a sense of what is going on. So what the Jewish community did, they sent out teachers, actually, because the schools were destroyed, to all of the temporary housing units throughout in the outskirts of the city, tent cities essentially, and they went tent to tent, and for those whose homes were not destroyed, door to door, to record basic demographic information about the members of the Jewish community, names, residence, occupation, whether their place of residence and work was destroyed or damaged by the fire, and if so, to what extent, whether they were in need of milk or coal or clothing, what their economic status was. So you get a lot of information from these documents. And here I just bring you one example, is from perhaps the most well-known writer coming out of this period, Joseph Nehama, who was the director of the Alliance Israélite Universelle School in Salonika, and also, as we'll see later, wrote a major, perhaps the first and one of the most important histories of the Jews of Thessaloniki, Histoire des Israélites de Thessalonique in French in the 1930s. And you will see here that one of the reasons that makes these archives difficult to access is not only where are they, and the fact that they have not been well documented, but also the vast majority of the records are written in Judeo-Spanish, in Ladino, in the Sephardic style of Hebrew cursive known as solitreo. So if you learn Hebrew today, you are not learning this script. So-called modern Hebrew is based on the Ashkenazic style of script. So we can talk a little bit more about that here, but this is Yosef David Nehama, and it says der, like director escola. And this tall mark here, a lot of people think, if you know Hebrew, a lot of people think that that's a lamed. That's not a lamed. This one here is a lamed. This is an aleph, which is much more like an Arabic alif, which may suggest the influence of the environment of the Ottoman Empire and the Arabic language script with which even Ottoman Turkish was once written. What these archives reveal, and you get a glimpse of it already with the census, is that the Jewish community, unlike in other parts of Europe, retained much of its self-governing legal status. You know, in other parts of Europe, as I'm sure many of you know, as part of the process of emancipation and as part of the process of granting Jews citizenship in the countries in which they lived, the Jewish communities, the self-governing kahals, were largely abolished. Well, that didn't happen in the Ottoman Empire, and it didn't happen in Greece. Actually, in the wake of World War I, Greece passes a new law that recognizes the Jewish community of Salonika as a legal entity before Greek law, and it is the only Jewish community, as far as I'm aware, that has such a robust legal status in Europe, which is an inheritance of the Ottoman context. And so the Jewish community, and you can see this discussed extensively, and it's going to be one of our themes today, was perceived to be like a municipality, like a city. The Jewish community, the Jewish community offices did everything that City Hall did. But instead of doing them for all the members of the city, it did them for the Jews living in the city. And here you can see one of these registers that was a photograph of the offices of the Jewish community with some of the various offices pointed out. The office of the chief rabbinate, here you can see the chief rabbinate, the Bet Din, and a variety of other secretarial offices. And you'll notice here that it's all listed in Greek, and then there are translations in German, because this is one of the volumes that was confiscated by the Rosenberg Special Commando and wound up in Germany and was eventually returned to Greece after the war. So in addition to these archives, I complement these archives with press sources, especially local press sources, because one of the problems that has faced the representation of the study of the Jews of Salonika is that the scholarship that's out there, to a greater or lesser extent, has largely been written from the outside looking in, relying on travelogues, on consul reports, or on the reportage of Jewish institutions like the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which is based in Paris. But that all of those has their own perspectives and biases. Not that these sources don't have biases, they definitely do. Of course, they present their perspectives, but they show inside perspectives, and especially those in Judeo-Spanish present perspectives of Jews of Salonika communicating, expressing their sense of self and place, their visions, their aspirations to themselves in their own language. And for me, that was very important to try to recapture and reconstitute the voices of the disparate Jews within the city. And I say again, the sense of a separation between the Jewish and Orthodox Christian and Muslim residents of the city was very strong because it was legalized. It was legalized that Jews belonged to the Jewish community, even if they were citizens. They belonged to the Jewish community, and their relationship with the state was mediated through the Jewish community. So we'll see a number of examples of these moving forward. But this is also why the press, here's one of the newspapers, El Pueblo, the People, which in the wake of World War I says there's not one Salonika, there are two. There's Jewish and there's Greek, or there's Jewish and there's Christian. We have our own institutions, we have our own neighborhoods, we have our own ways of life. And this is the tension. This was a tension that was embedded in the late Ottoman dynamics, and is a tension that would be perpetuated in Greece, which is how can you become an official, like legal member, like a citizen of a Jewish community, and also, while at the same time the state is telling you, become a citizen of the country you now reside in, become a citizen of Greece. Learn Greek, tie your fate to the Greek state, the Greek nation, and the Greek destiny, but oh yeah, definitely remember that you're still part of a Jewish community. And that we are going to look at you, no matter what you do, as a Jew, legally. So what does this result in? It actually results in not the dissolution of the Jewish governing bodies in Salonika. They had like a Jewish parliament in Ottoman times. What actually winds up taking place is sort of a modernization of that body and a democratization of that body. So instead of only wealthy people being able to participate in communal politics and become elected as officers in the communal council and the General Assembly, now it's universal male suffrage is introduced. So now you have, instead of 1,200 people voting, you have 20, 30,000 people voting for community elections. And here you can see in the registers that come from Moscow that Putin was talking about, here you can see a list of voters. And again, in Solitreo, this is for the community elections. In the Sephardic Hebrew cursive, it gives you their names, it gives you their address, and it gives you their professions and ages. So you can get a sense of the wide range. We're not only talking about merchants here, we're not only talking about industrialists, we're not only talking about, although they were participating there, the big center of industry, tobacco, flour, cotton, textiles. So you have a wide range. This is just from one page that I looked at. You get a sense. And the sense that the Jews in the city are connected to their community is not only legislated by Greek law and by statutes that are articulated by the Jewish community of Salonika, but this sense of rights and duties, not only vis-a-vis the Greek state, but also with regard to the Jewish community, is something that the members of the Jewish community are aware of. So one of the more interesting documents I found from the 1930s, again in the Sephardic cursive style of Hebrew, is a group of prisoners who have been locked up in the major prison in Salonika for crimes that are not described here, but they write on the eve of Pesach, Passover, to the Jewish community of Salonika, saying that even though we have committed crimes, we retain our rights as members of the Jews of Salonika, members of the Jewish community of Salonika, and therefore we demand that the Jewish community of Salonika provide us with matzah to celebrate the holiday of Pesach while we are imprisoned. So that's really fascinating for a number of reasons, that they want to, they're criminals, but the convicted criminals, but they want to observe Pesach, and that they expect the Jewish community to fulfill this wish. And it seems that they do. They provide them with matzah and olives and cheese, as far as I can tell. So maybe not a Passover feast, but it is a modicum of recognition of their status. Throughout the 1930s, the Greek state reinforces the role that the Jewish community plays in adjudicating legal domains for the members of the Jewish community. So the most important domain in which the Jewish community retained authority was the domain of family status. You might say, okay, well, who cares? Okay, marriage, divorce, alimony, things like that. Okay, yeah, sure, it's a Jewish thing. But you could not get married in Greece unless you had the authority and authorization of the religious officials. So if you were Jewish, you had to go and apply to the Jewish community, and they would vet you to determine whether, according to Jewish law, you were authorized to marry. And you would have to fill out a dowry, and you'd have to fill out a petition, you'd have to pay a special tax. And you could not marry a Christian, nor could you marry a Muslim. And this is like, we think of this as kind of a dynamic of the pre-modern world. There was no civil marriage. Civil marriage is one of the reforms that was introduced in the formation of a unified citizenship in many parts of Europe already in the 19th century, to enable the citizens of a country to contract marriage unions and produce offspring together. Is one of the ways in which you can formulate a national identity. So like in Germany, this is one of the reasons why there were so many marriages between Jews and non-Jews. In Greece, there were very few because it was illegal. You couldn't do it unless, with two exceptions, unless you converted to the other's religion, of which there were some but few examples, or you went abroad, especially to a place like Brussels. Wealthy couples would do this. They would come and they would have a civil marriage and they return to Greece. Okay? And that would be recognized by the authority, by the Greek authorities. Now, what the Greek authorities does here in the 1930s, and this is a clipping also from Moscow, from a Judeo-Spanish newspaper, it says that the Greek state will put you, if you are Jewish, in prison, the Greek state, if you violate the rulings of the rabbis as it relates to divorce and levirate marriage, which is a category of marriage we're not going to get into right now, but again, related to this family status. So this is devolving great deal of authority on the part of the Greek state to the Jewish community, that reminds the citizens of the state, Jews and Christians, that even if they may be citizens, their status is different, their fate is different. They cannot create marital relations together. They cannot create a family unit together. So this is going to be an important limiting factor in understanding the framework of Greek national identity, because essentially it will be encoded in law that the Christians are the Greeks and that the Jews are Jews, and that the Jews have to go to the Jewish community to get married, and they have to go through the Jewish community to achieve a lot of the things that you might otherwise expect to go to your city hall or to go to your state in order to accomplish. So here's another example, the power of the rabbis, which is really fascinating here. So a Jewish woman is pregnant, and she is brought before the rabbinical court. And the rabbinical court compels her to sign an affidavit here, says that she's had a relation with a non-Jewish man, and she promises here that she will stop having this relationship with a non-Jewish man, and that essentially, if she gives birth to a boy, she will circumcise the boy and raise him according to the traditions of the Jewish faith. The coercive power of the rabbis here, at the bequest and desire of the Greek state, is really, really fascinating here. And I think it speaks to the way in which the Jewish community was really a relatively robust institution that complicates the question of, well, Jews becoming Greeks. It's not just Jews as individuals, like assimilating into Greek society. You have this very powerful institution mediating that relationship, both at the desire on the part of the rabbinic authorities and the communal leaders, with the exception of the essentially the liberals in the Jewish community who wanted to dissolve the Jewish community. They just wanted to be citizens like everybody else. But the rabbinate and the communal authorities wanted to maintain the power of the community, and so did the Greek state. They didn't want to have to deal with the Zionists and the assimilationists and then the religious Zionists and the Jewish communists. No, we're just going to deal with the Jews through the Jewish community. Now, the Jewish community was connected to other aspects of the Jewish world, and you can see these. I'm talking about tens of thousands of documents. I only was able to look at a sliver of this material. Mina Rosen in Israel has also looked at some of this material, but there's still tons out there that nobody's really looked at. But one of the documents that I found I thought was super interesting, that shows these kinds of connections, was a document here from World War II. The war hasn't begun yet in Greece, but it is a document that says gastes por enviar lulavim et rogim y adas a diversas ciudades de Polonia. So this is a list of expenses to send the ritual items that are necessary to observe the Jewish holiday of Sukkot to the Jewish communities of Poland in 1940. It shows the connections between the Jewish community. What's fascinating here is they send lulavs and etrogs to the small Jewish community of Oswiecim, which had just then recently been occupied by the Nazi forces and had been renamed as Auschwitz. It's really fascinating to recognize that the last Sukkot that the small Jewish community of Auschwitz observed before their destruction was made possible by ritual objects sent to them from the Jews of Salonika, which is like kind of an eerie thing. And also to see the name Auschwitz there, the only thing written in Latin letters in this document from 1940. The records of the Jewish community give us a complex view of this process of becoming Greek, and what does it mean for Jewish Orthodox Christian relations, and the contours and the meaning of Greek national identity. And we can see this complexity at play in one of my favorite postcards that I came across in my research. It's a photograph of the Jewish orphanage, Jewish girls' orphanage in Salonika, the Meir Abov orphanage. And if you look at this image, there are a lot of clues about how the architects of this institution are trying to project their sense of identity and affiliation to the world. So look, this is a postcard that was sent for the Jewish New Year. So it has a Jewish New Year's greeting, the Sephardic Jewish New Year's greeting, which is Tisku Leshanim Rabot, which is may you merit many years. Okay. And then it says the name of the institution in Ladino in Hebrew letters, Orfelinato de Ijas Meir Aboav. Then it says the year, according to the Hebrew calendar, with a Magen David, a Star of David, and the word Sion, Zion, because the funders of this orphanage were Zionists. Okay, they're Sephardic, they're Zionist. But they're also Greek. And here you can see in bigger font the name of the orphanage in Greek letters. And then you can see it here in French, which is to say, we are Sephardic, we are Jewish, we are Zionist, we are Greek, we are also European, which is what the French is supposed to project. And we are here in Thessaloniki. We are Salonicians. And you can see the bilingualism that is manifest in the educational curriculum, because it says teacher and student written there in Greek and also in Judeo-Spanish in the Sephardic Hebrew cursive. And you can see here the teacher pointing to a map of Greece with her ruler specifically pointing out the city of Thessaloniki itself. I'm bringing you this image because it shows you the multiple layers here, and it shows you that these multiple manifestations of cultural, political, and geographic religious affiliation could be held at the same time. And this was not perceived as an existential crisis, although it very well could have been. But there was a moment in this period of the 1920s and 1930s in which it was perceived on the part of Salonican Jewish leaders that you could be all of these things, and there would be a place for you in your city and in the future of your country. That you could speak Judeo-Spanish and be still part of Greece. That you could be a Zionist and still be part of the Greek project. A new discourse emerges in the 1920s. And this is a discourse that is referred to as Hellenic Judaism. This idea that Jews are part of the Hellenic experience. What they do is they begin to rewrite their story. The story of the Jews of Salonika will now no longer begin in 1492 with the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and their arrival in the Ottoman Empire. No, they would rewrite the story and bring us back to the times of antiquity. And this would help bolster their sense of Greekness, legitimacy in the Greek space. That Jews have been present in Thessaloniki and in the region since essentially the time of antiquity, through the Byzantine era, continuing until today. And they begin to promote the acquisition of the Greek language. This is one of the main demands that the Greek state says. Say, become Greek. Become Greek. How do you become Greek? Learn the Greek language. They say, if you learn the Greek language, you will be accepted as part of the Greek people. This is the offer that is put in play, especially by the liberal governments of Venizelos, who is the founder of the Republic of Greece. He says, speak Greek, you'll become Greek. You will become Greek. Well, now this is a different criterion than is the criterion that's articulated with the Revolutionary War, which says only those who believe in Christ are Greek. Now the argument, the offer is speak Greek and you become Greek. So you can see the development of Greek Jewish newspapers. You can see the participation of Jews in the Greek military. Here is registrations in Judeo-Spanish of Jewish soldiers. This guy is wearing his uniform, being inducted into the Greek military, which, by the way, was delegated to the chief rabbi. The chief rabbi was responsible for inducting the Jews into the Greek army. And here you can see a guy, you can see he's not so comfortable writing his name in Greek, but he manages it here, to write his name in Greek. This new narrative of Greek-Jewish symbiosis becomes a real attempt on the part of Jewish intellectuals, and this was shared across the political spectrum. Liberals are making an argument along this line, assimilationists, saying we are Greek because of this. Also, Zionists are making this argument because they're also speaking the language of nationalism. And they're also seeing synergies between Zionism and Greek nationalism. They see, as the early Zionists did, the Greek national movement as inspiration for Jewish nationalism. Okay? And they go to material markers. They go to the cemetery and they find ancient sarcophagi and tombstones in the cemetery that document Jewish presence in the city since the time of Apostle Paul. And scholars such as Joseph Nehama, who I mentioned, begin to write about this history, although in French, largely, or in Judeo-Spanish, to a lesser extent in Greek, to try to integrate Jews into the narrative of the city, into the Greek national narrative. And the Jewish community as an institution takes very seriously the prospect and possibility of transforming Ottoman Jews into Hellenic Jews through the acquisition of language. And if you look at the curricular materials for the Jewish schools, and most of the Jews in the city until the late 1920s attended the Jewish community schools, which were essentially public schools run by the Jewish community for Jews. And what's fascinating here is you can see there's an argument that's been made in the scholarship and in popular memory that the Jews didn't become Greek. They were stubborn. They were obstinate. They refused to adopt the Greek language, and they clung to Judeo-Spanish. They clung to their difference. Well, here what's interesting is you can see the language that's being excised from the curriculum is not Greek. Greek will become the dominant language in the curriculum. It's Judeo-Spanish that's excised from the curriculum. So the Jewish community leadership, which was largely comprised of those who call themselves moderates, who were interested in assimilation, and Zionists, who were interested in creating a Greek-Jewish identity that was nationalist in form, that was kind of a binational identity, are pushing for the incorporation of Greek language into the curriculum. They want to be good Greeks and good Jews, good nationalists. The Greek state gets involved and does something else very interesting, which is that they begin to establish, on the eve of the Great Depression, they sponsor new schools for Jewish students. So there were just the regular Greek state schools. You can see few Jews attending Greek state schools in the 1920s. But by the 1930s, you have quite a number of Jewish students attending Jewish schools specifically for Jews. So again, there's a paradox here of integration. We are going to essentially forcibly integrate Jews into Greek society by keeping them separate from Greek Orthodox Christians. So they will go through a process of Greek acculturation, essentially unconnected to their Greek Orthodox Christian peers. They will be largely I'm talking about the masses here. They're going to be going largely to Jewish community schools, or they're going to be going to Greek state schools for Jewish children. Those are the two main paths. And this dynamic is compounded, and I want to move to the conclusion here by acknowledging the compounding factor here being the growing tensions over the definition of national identity that emerge and come to the fore, especially with the arrival of masses of Orthodox Christian refugees who come from Turkey in the wake of another war between Greece and Turkey that results in a massive exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey, which was in lieu of establishing national homogeneity. Greece invaded mainland Turkey and sought to occupy, and did for a short time, eastern Anatolia, and tried to conquer Istanbul, Constantinople, to reestablish kind of the grandeur of Greece and the Greek Empire, Byzantine Empire. They were unsuccessful and were expelled by the forces of Kemal Mustafa Ataturk in a conflict that in Greek national memory is known as the Great Catastrophe, and in Turkish national memory is known as the Turkish War of Independence. Very different resonances of that event. That results in the exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey, but the criteria according to which the exchange takes place is religion. Orthodox Christians are expelled from Turkey and sent to Greece, and Muslims are expelled from Greece and sent to Turkey. The Greek government strategically sends 100,000 of these Orthodox Christian refugees from Turkey to Salonika to change once and for all the demographic imprint on the city, to make it like ethnically Greek or religiously Orthodox Christian. The irony, the great irony, is that many of these Orthodox Christian refugees coming from Asia Minor spoke only Turkish. They spoke only Turkish. They were also the object of denigration on the part of the autochthonous Greek Orthodox Christians already living in mainland Greece. They were like the Turks baptized in yogurt, was one of the phrases that was used to denigrate them. Like they were like Turks. They spoke Turkish. They came from Anatolia. And this created extensive tensions between the refugee population, the prosfiges, and the Jewish population. Because the prosfiges, the refugees, are coming to essentially a foreign country, a foreign city that they're told is their own country. They're returning home to the Greek homeland, and they find a city in which the plurality of the population are Ladino-speaking Jews. And this creates tension, further tensions, as one of the criteria that is articulated for national belonging, in addition to, or maybe even in lieu of, religious affiliation, will become language. And Jews have maybe even a heads up in acquiring the Greek language. Or certainly they will be in parallel paths. The processes of the refugees and the processes of Jews acquiring the Greek language in schools would develop along the same path. These tensions result in a variety of different manifestations because many of these refugees will be settled in the outskirts of the city next to essentially housing projects run by the Jewish community that were established for Jewish refugees from the fire of 1917. So you'll have impoverished refugee populations living next to each other, struggling over limited resources, contesting and making claims for belonging to the nation. That would lead, for example, to the refugee population, the Orthodox Christian refugee population, to successfully petition the Greek state to enforce a new Sunday closing law that would end the practice of resting on the Sabbath in the city, the Jewish Sabbath. And the intention was to give Orthodox Christians an upper hand in business, to institute Sunday closing as opposed to Saturday closing, so that Jews would either have to violate the Sabbath or lose a day of business. So this was one of a variety of different measures. Jews were forced to vote in a separate electoral college at the same time that they're being integrated into Greek schools. So there are all these tensions and contradictions in the process of becoming Greek, in the boundaries of Greek identity. They come to a head in the context of the Depression, when a group of ultra-nationalists, Orthodox Christians, led by, it's noteworthy, a exclusively Turkish-speaking Orthodox Christian Greek nationalist leader, organizes essentially the first pogrom in the history of the city's existence against the Jews. And the headline reads in the press the next day, "Has Salonika become Zhytomyr or Kishinev?" These are like the images of anti-Jewish violence in Eastern Europe. The scholarship on this subject has suggested, see, this was the punishment that the Jews received for not embracing their Greek homeland, for not learning the Greek language, for not becoming Greek. What the archives that I've been looking at suggest is a different story. They suggest to me not that Jews were not becoming Greek, not that they were not learning the Greek language. The children, the young people, they were learning Greek. They were learning Greek. They spoke unaccented Greek, or accented like Greeks. What they were doing was proposing a different meaning for what it means to be Greek. That the criteria for Greekness are no longer going to be faith in Christ as initially articulated by the first constitution of Greece, or even as articulated now by the Constitution of Greece, which is articulated in the name of the Trinity, still today in Greece. The suggestion, however, is that language, culture, civic criteria for understanding Greek national belonging will be the criteria that leaders of the Jewish community across a variety of different political spectrum, this is the argument that they will make. And this will be an argument that Turkish-speaking Orthodox Christians will resist, because their claim to Greek national identity is undermined if it's articulated according to language, because they don't necessarily have the language. What they have is they have the religion. And so my argument, and it's exploratory argument, I only alluded to it in my book, but it's something that I hope to develop further, is that it's this tension over not did the Jews of Thessaloniki become Greek? No, it's what was the meaning of Greekness? It was not set. It was an evolving paradigm, a contested paradigm by residents, citizens, different state actors and government officials. And it's that cultural, civic understanding of Greekness that again remains in tension with the legal system of Greece, that continues to separate out its Jewish and Christian residents for legal purposes. And we can see this, and I'll conclude here, with an observation by the German consul in Salonika in 1937, in which he praises Greece for the law that prohibits Jews and Christians from marrying each other. And this is seen from the perspective of this Nazi official, so we're already in the period of Nazi Germany, as a sign of the successful way in which Greece implemented a racial regime, of separating out the populations. The Greek state is de facto, if not in the legal sense, inclined toward anti-Semitism. The Orthodox Church plays a major role in the true anti-Semitic inclination by forbidding intermarriage with Jews. With this, the Salonican Jews cling strongly to their religion because they have no other choice. I mean, maybe they have a choice, but they also have no choice. Conversions to the Orthodox Church are rare. A feeling of foreignness exists between the Jews and the Greeks that is similar to that which National Socialist Germany aims to achieve through its Jewish policy. So here, the Greek state, the liberal Greek state, although in its wake, now we're in the period of the dictatorship of Metaxas, but it inherits Ottoman law and Greek republican law, separates its residents. And from my perspective, this, not the question of cultural assimilation or linguistic acquisition, would be one of the defining ways and factors that explain the trajectories of Jews in the city, in Salonika and in Greece more generally, and also their fate during the Second World War. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you so much, Devin, for a fascinating glimpse into your research. I mean, what I find really interesting, fascinating, is the way you showed us how you're using your sources and what kind of insights your sources make us enable us to see a different image of the Jewish self-understanding of that period. So that's really fascinating. For the audience, just repeat what I do usually, namely that you can pose your questions in different ways. You can either just raise your hand, I mean the yellow hand, but you can also write questions in the chat or just speak. We are, I think, about 20 people in the audience. So if I don't see you or you think you should say something, then just intervene. A long question. Can you actually see the question in the chat as well?
Yeah, I see that question. Yeah, from Rosa. Yeah.
From Rosa Reicher?
Yeah.
Maybe you could
digitization online. Pardon? Yeah. Go ahead.
Maybe you could just summarize it for the rest and then.
Yeah, it's a question about the use of the internet as an aid for academic research that provides information to more readily accessible through digitization. So the question is about digital mapping and also about how this could play out in relationship to Jewish Salonika. You could, with the records that are in Moscow and in the other places, you could map out, not everybody, but you could map out tens of thousands of residents and businesses of the Jews of Salonika in the pre-war world. You could see it, you could visualize, you could take a tour through the streets of Thessaloniki and you could say, these people live here, this was, and you could begin to build profiles of the people. You might be able, there are thousands of photographs of people. There are thousands of correspondence of people. There are petitions that they write to the Jewish community. You could really begin to get a sense of that urban space and the lives of the people that once walked those streets, and their institutions, and their homes, and their synagogues, and their philanthropies. I mean, there were over 20 Jewish institutions that were run by the Jewish community, from hospital and medical dispensary to Jewish insane asylum, the orphanage for girls that we saw, orphanage for boys, all the tuberculosis clinic, tons of institutions like that, in addition to a dozen schools, to a half a dozen popular neighborhoods. You could kind of map all of that out, and you could really create some amazing database work. And if anybody's interested in getting involved in that kind of a thing, I'd be very open to discussing that. I think it would really transform the way that we literally see the city of Thessaloniki. It would require a major collaborative effort. There are registers that we have, not for all of the neighborhoods, but we have registers for some of the neighborhoods from 1934, for example, that list all the residents of a given neighborhood. their addresses, their professions. Remarkable. Whether they were getting support from the Bikor Cholim, like the medical society, the census registers that I mentioned. I mean, just a ton of material there that would really, I think, would change literally how we see the city and how the city would see itself. Because I think, one of the things about Thessaloniki is that, Mark Mazauer in his book on the city, which does not consult any of these archives, he called the city city of ghosts, because the present day inhabitants of the city are not well aware of the past. And that's changed in recent years. There's more recognition. There's more public acknowledgement. When I began my research, there was nothing. But now there is. There are some markers. There are some monuments. But I think if you were to create some kind of online map that would just show the extent of the Jewish presence and how Jews participated in the urban fabric of the city, I think that would really be shocking, striking for the residents of the city. Today, it would also probably be dangerous because collaborators might be implicated. So, well, if you live in this house now and so was living in it then, how did you get it now? Or how did your parents or grandparents get it? And, I could do that. I could walk you through the center of Thessaloniki and I could tell you this business got it from this person and this, but, that's not going to be so fun in terms of creating a copacetic relationship. It may be tension, but I think if that dark chapter of the past cannot be confronted, then I don't really see a path forward. So digital tools could be really essential. Really essential.
That's amazing. I mean, it leads me to a question that I wanted to pose later in the discussion, but since you address it now, I mean, this would be a virtual reconstruction of a lost and destroyed place, decades after destruction. And of course, it affects two different perceptions. I mean, of Jewish survivors, of the next generation, of immigrants, Jewish on the one hand, on the other hand, what you already indicated, today's Greek perception of that past. That leads me to the question, I mean, can you give an idea of how after 1945 this kind of memory of the Jewish past of Salonika developed? I mean, you already indicated there are changes today, but how was that immediately after the war and during the decades after that?
I mean, it was erased, I guess, it was erased from the urban fabric. I mean, the synagogues, the institutions were almost all obliterated. The Jewish neighborhoods, the homes were transferred, the businesses were transferred to Orthodox Christian hands, and Jews were written out of the national narrative. There was not. It was inconvenient to have the second biggest city in Greece, of which Thessaloniki is, to say, well, for 500 years, half the population were Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews. That does not contribute to securing a Greek national identity for the city. And the city, Thessaloniki, was in a kind of tenuous position, not only in the wake of the Second World War, which would lead up essentially into the Greek Civil War, but also the status of Thessaloniki as a border town, or near the border at least, the sense of irredentist, or the fears of irredentist claims, not only part of Turkey but especially Bulgaria, and Thessaloniki became a more conservative town. It became a nationalist town. It became a town that defended the Greek identity, in part because of the refugee population, in part because of its position, in part because of the context of the Civil War, and in part because of the geopolitics of the Balkans. And so there was not space in that context for discussion of, let's say, minorities in Greece. Also because Greece did not recognize only religious minorities. Didn't recognize national minorities. This was already with the Treaty of, with the League of Nations minorities treaties after World War I. And so in the wake of the war in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it's really only with the end of the Cold War and the opening up a little bit in the region, and also tourism would play a role, do there become some whispers about the Jewish past in Thessaloniki. In 1997, for example, Thessaloniki is named the cultural capital of Europe. So there's a lot of attention on the city, and this becomes one of the moments in which the Jewish history in the city will be discussed publicly. One of the first scholars of Jews of Greece in this period in the 80s and 90s, Rena Malcho, when she started writing, she got bricks thrown through her window. I mean, people didn't want that kind of history to be put front and center. And so I can stop there, but I would say that's sort of the dynamic that would obtain through the period of the Cold War, and then there would be an opening up, or as Rika Benveniste, who's another Greek Jewish scholar at the University of Thessaly, says, the coming out of Jewish history in Greece would transpire in the 90s, and it would begin with this kind of celebratory phase, and then move to a kind of my work is more it's not so it's a critical assessment that we need to have more of.
I mean, if I can follow up that, because I would be very interested in your experience as a Jewish scholar who comes to Greek in the first decade of the 21st century and encounters the way Greek society, even maybe Greek historians, view that history. And I was wondering, is there some sort of, I mean, is there an interaction between non-Jewish Greek historians and the community of historians in the US, for example, or in Israel, who work on these questions?
I would say that from the time that I began, let's say my first trip to Greece 17 years ago, and now, completely different scene, I would say. That when I first arrived, there was some interest, but quite a bit of tentative steps. The Jewish community of Salonika, which still exists, it still operates according to to the same Greek law of 1920, with some modifications. They were developing they developed a series of conferences on Judeo-Spanish culture. So that's what brought me there in the first place. So that was kind of a coming out. Developing a public profile around Jewish life in the city, in the Jewish past. And I would make some very good friends, both among Jewish scholars and Christian scholars in the city. And I would say now there is even a newer generation, my age, younger than me, of students in Greece who are much more interested in the Jewish past. I think a lot of it there's a political element to it. So, and a generational element, those who are, trying to reimagine Greek identity more generally, thinking about the places of minorities in the society, Muslims in particular, in society today, are thinking about the Jewish historical context in a way to imagine what a Greece might look like in the future that could have space for a variety of different kinds of populations, communities, and residents. And so there's a lot of work that's been done now, especially on the Holocaust period and on the issue of collaboration, which is very sensitive, but it's now being spoken about, certainly in scholarly circles. There at the University of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, there is now a friend of mine, Jackie Ben Mayor, is offering courses in Judeo-Spanish to teach students, mostly non-Jewish students, but some Jewish students, how to read the language. And I think that once there is a group of scholars who know Judeo-Spanish, and once these archives become more accessible, then I think there will be material for people. There's 100 dissertations waiting to be written in these archives. I mean, I just touched the surface with the thousands of pages that I look through, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of pages. And I think that would really be a major contribution and open the city up moving forward. If I could add just one final piece on this question, is that there's still, I would say, a dueling dynamic between some anxieties about recognizing the Jewish past and what the implications are for Greek national memory, and also a way in which there are certain risks involved. So in recent years, the university established a monument on its campus to acknowledge that the University of Salonika now sits on top of what had been the Jewish cemetery of Salonika. And the Jewish cemetery of Salonika was the largest in Europe. It was twice as big as that of Krakow. It had like 400,000 graves. It was the size of 80 football fields. It had graves going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it was destroyed in part by the Greek authorities already in the 1930s, and then it was completed at the initiative of local Greek leaders, Greek Christian leaders and institutions during the German occupation. Now, when they erected this monument a number of years ago, the Jewish community and the university, they indicated, yes, that the cemetery once stood there, but they also indicated that it was destroyed by the Nazis and their collaborators, rather than the local authorities, because that truth was still a little bit too far to go at this time. And so we may say, you may see this is actually a setback, a falsification of history, or you may see it as a kind of a step in a progress to one day we'll be able to accept the truth. We can't do it yet, but maybe one day we can. And I think that that's sort of the tension that's still in play in Thessaloniki today.
Yeah. There's a comment in chat. There are also now several very nice Jewish museums that opened in Greece, especially the one in Athens. And thank you for and the question would be what the role of the Orthodox Church has been in the process of Greek nation building back then and also now.
Yeah, well, you have that's an excellent question, set of questions there. So you'll have to have me back for like a more contemporary conversation. But I mean, there's Jewish Museum in Athens is a wonderful institution. The Jewish Museum of Thessaloniki is also a very, very important institutions that are promoting, putting forward a public profile, and I think especially touches a lot of youth. Greek youth who visit the institutions. I don't know what the status has been during COVID, but at least over the last 10 or 15 years, that have been very, very formative. In terms of the Byzantine Jewish history, this would become a very important piece for the intellectuals in Greece as they tried to, just as Greek nationalists did, tried to stitch together a national narrative that would link, ancient Greece, from Plato to Alexander the Great to the Byzantine era to contemporary times, kind of stitch together a narrative. Jewish intellectuals were trying to stitch together a Greek Jewish narrative along the same lines. So the Byzantine period becomes very, very important there in filling a gap between the ancient period and the present period. So again, they went to the cemetery, they went to some textual sources to say, look, we were here, we belonged then, and we kind of belong now. As for the church, well, the church, historically, there was a kind of a cooperation, I would say, between the rabbis and the church in this earlier period, because the rabbinic leaders and the church leaders in Thessaloniki, for example, agreed that they were going to preclude civic marriage, and we are going to have family law matters being within our own respective jurisdiction. And so there was actually quite a good relationship, you could say, a cordial relationship, a diplomatic relationship between the church and the Jewish community in Thessaloniki. If you take the matters on the national level and you expand it to the period of the Second World War, you might be familiar with the famous letter that Damoskinos, who was the Archbishop of Greece based in Athens, wrote protesting the deportation of the Jews of Thessaloniki in March of 1943, which was one of very few such statements on the part of the leader of a European church opposing the deportation of the Jews. And he did so in a very fascinating way, which is he appealed to Apostle Paul, who, by the way, had been in Thessaloniki 1,500 years previously, and he appeals to Galatians. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's this famous phrase: "We are neither man nor woman, free or slave, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. And Damoskinos kinds of riffs on it, and he says, they're neither Greeks or Jews, but we're all citizens of Mother Greece. And he says that as citizens, they served in the war, they belong to Greece, don't deport them. And in Athens, where there was a small Jewish community, a very discreet Jewish community, we're talking 1,000. Athens actually was the only Jewish community in Greece. Population increased as a result of the war. Many intellectuals sign Damoskinos' petition opposing the deportation of the Jews of Greece, and the Jews of Thessaloniki in particular. How many intellectuals, public leaders, officials, university administrators endorsed Damoskinos' statement who are based in Thessaloniki? 0. So there's a very important, and my colleague Andrew Apostolou has written about the exception of Salonika, and in some ways Salonika is the exception that maybe also proves the rule, because this was the vast bulk of the Jews of Greece were living in the city, and none of the leadership in that city intervened in any kind of organized way to support them during the period of the deportation, whereas Athens is completely different.
There's a question from Helen Sibylla.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And although I think your argument was quite compelling that actually it was religion and not language which was crucial in the question of recognition as Greeks, or not, yeah, not non-Greeks, but who should be recognized as Greek. I would like to come back to the question of language. And I'm quite interested in the Romaniotes, the role of the Romaniotes in comparison to the Sephardic Jewish community. And the first part of the question would be, I'm sorry, I'm a bit long, would be how are the numbers? How do they relate to each other? Of course, I guess the community of the Romaniotes was much smaller than the community of the Sephardic Jews, and they were originally Greek-speaking Jews, as at least that's how I know them. And was it really? I mean, the Jews of Saloniki and other Greek Jews, didn't they speak Greek at all? Or only a little bit? I haven't really understood this, because you said that the children learned Greek in school, and then they spoke without an accent. And how was it with the older Jews? Because I kind of compared to areas, other areas or regions in Europe, like the Bukovina, also on, and of course the Jewish community there was multilingual, so the question of language was not such a problem. So yeah, thank you very much for listening to my long question. Yeah.
These are really great questions. In terms of numbers, the Jews of Thessaloniki were the overwhelming majority of the Jews in Greece. I would have to check to see to confirm the numbers, but if we have maybe 85,000 Jews in Greece, we have 60,000 Jews in Salonika, and there are really few exclusively Greek-speaking communities. Yanina in Epirus being the most important of the Greek-speaking communities, but even a place like Athens is mixed. So Athens is made up of some Romanio Jews, some Ashkenazi Jews. A Rothschild comes to Athens with the Bavarian king in the middle of the 19th century. The Bavarian guy becomes the king of Greece under European tutelage. And then many refugees from the fire of 1917 in Salonika, and the war and the burning of Smyrna in the 1920s wind up coming to Athens too. So if you look at the people who are deported from Athens, you'll find their birthplaces from all over the place, Salonika and Izmir, among other places. So there's I guess I would say we cannot necessarily draw very clear lines between Romaniot and Sephardic Jews, even Salonika being a very mixed community of which Judeo-Spanish would remain the lingua franca, certainly of the older generations and certainly of the institutions of the Jewish community. But even there, you begin to see the institutions of the Jewish community. For example, the soup kitchen, the Matanot Levionim, they start conducting their minutes in Greek in the 1930s, late 1930s. The Jewish community hires a secretary of the Greek language in 1933. And so it's it's a variegated process of the acquisition of the Greek language. And actually, let me share a screen again. I have a couple of extra slides just in case somebody was going to ask, and you happen to ask here. The Romaniot Jews, or native Greek-speaking Jews, play a very important role as a bridge to the Greek cultural world. So what's fascinating, even if Salonika is in popular imagination a Sephardic community, many of the leaders of the community in the 1930s will be native Greek-speaking Jews who were born and raised in other parts of Greece. So the president of the Jewish community, Moises, Asher Moises, comes from Thessaly, and he comes from a community that speaks Judeo-Spanish and Greek. The lawyer of the Jewish community comes from the same place, and he speaks Judeo-Spanish and Greek. Teachers in the Jewish schools are brought from Volos, which they are native Greek speakers. So you have this fascinating phenomenon in which we might say Romaniot, if we can use that as a synonym for, like, let's say, native Greek-speaking Jews, will come to play very important leadership roles in Salonika in the 1930s as they seek to transform an Ottoman Sephardic Jewish community into a Greek Jewish community. And one of the ways that this is done is, again, through the schools. So, like, here we have 1940. I mean, think about, again, one of the paradoxes of Greece. Think about this. Think about what's happening in other parts of Europe. Jews are getting kicked out of public schools and universities. And here in Greece, Jews are not only getting integrated into the public schools, but the Greek state is sponsoring new textbooks for the use by Jewish students in the Greek language that have lessons about Judaism. Because again, the importance of religion was such, so everybody takes religion in school. Before, the Jewish students would be exempt from the religion class, or sometimes they would be forced to sit through it, and that became an element of consternation and debate. But now they say, look, we're going to have Jewish teachers come in and teach our kids, the Jewish students, Judaism in Greek in the Jewish schools. That's a really fascinating dynamic. And again, it's like this kind of tenuous, can you do it both? Can you do both? Can you become Greek linguistically and remain Jewish religiously? And that was sort of the balancing act that was being attempted on the eve of the war here, or even into the war before Greece is occupied or invaded. And Romaniot Jews, Greek-speaking Jews, play a very important role as a bridge in this process.
I think there's Antonia Steins. There's one more question.
Right. I'll be as brief as possible. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I would like to pose a question that has to do with the picture of the classroom that you showed. You stated that from a Jewish point of view, Jewish, European, and Greek identity were all compatible. I am wondering, in comparison with the German discourse in the 19th century, where the Christian majority presented intellectualized arguments against the compatibility of Jewish identity and modern citizenship, where Jewish thinkers were similarly eager to become accepted into society, but also critically answered to this claim. Have you come upon any statements from members of the Jewish community that make the compatibility argument explicit, either against Orthodox Christian majoritarian thinking or within the community itself? So you showed that in praxis, this compatibility was there. Have you found any explicit arguments?
Yeah, excellent. That's a really excellent question. And I actually don't have my book with me, but actually, yeah, I do. I have a few of these quotes that I think go to this. One of the guys who is maybe the most articulate in this, if I could, maybe I can show my screen one more time, and I can show you this guy. To this effect is sorry, this guy, Mentes Betsanji, who was a Greek patriot and a Zionist. He spoke like 10 languages. He was a journalist. He was a member of Greek parliament. And he makes the argument that, again, sort of playing with this idea of the motherland, playing with the discourses of Apostle Paul, he will make the argument throughout the 1920s and 1930s that Jews and Greeks can both be Hellenic citizens. So this is one. So there's some nuance in language here. So he's going to try to make, and it's not abided by all the time, but figures like Betsanji are going to make an argument that you can be Jewish and you can be Greek or Orthodox, and we are both together Hellenic citizens. So sometimes this argument takes the form of Jews and Christians as two religious groups who can be part of the shared polity. And sometimes it takes the form as there are these two nations, Jews and Greeks, and we have shared Greek citizenship. This will also be manifest in the way in which, interestingly enough, the Judeo-Spanish press will sometimes come to the defense of Muslims and sometimes come to the defense of Orthodox Christian refugees on the grounds that we are all Hellenic citizens. We are all Hellenes, citizens of the Hellenic motherland. And it doesn't matter if you're Jewish, and it doesn't matter if you're Muslim, and it doesn't matter if you're a refugee. So in terms of articulating a kind of more capacious understanding of Hellenism that is decoupled from Orthodox Christianity, you can see that argument being made in the press and in institutional documents and in figures, in the work of figures like Betsanji. And whether it's successful is a different question. I would say I don't think it necessarily succeeds. I don't think it has necessarily succeeded in Greece even till today. But it certainly was an argument that was put forward, and there was some traction that it did have at the time. But you do see this kind of articulation of a kind of a Hellenic civil or civic identity organized around participation in political institutions, national institutions, residence in Greek, and speaking the Greek language. That is also not a hardcore assimilationist approach either. Like, it's recognizing difference, preserving an echo of that Ottoman kind of plurality. Like they say, there are Christians, there are Jews and Muslims. We're not going to disappear. We're going to be who we are, but we're also going to be Hellenes, despite our differences, because of the elements that we share in common.
Thank you, Devin. We have only just started discussing the variety of possible questions, and I think there's much to be discussed, which means we have to bring you back in person as soon as it is possible.
My pleasure.
Thank you so very much. This was a wonderful talk and a great discussion. We are running out of time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Usually I would take you out for dinner. Even that isn't possible. But I could only thank you also in the name of the audience. And I hope we will see each other again soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you for this opportunity. And thank you for
the audience. We will have a break now.